could be.
We can be. Right now we are.
Fire.
And I've got to turn the song off. There we go. And somehow we must get our faces on the screen. Hello, everyone.
Good evening.
And welcome back if you're joining us. Again, if this is your first time here, welcome to the conversation. My name is Ben, and this is Max.
Hi, it's Max and Ben that Save the World, a men's mental health podcast.
Yeah. Welcome to Max and Ben Save the World. We're going to talk about...
It was his job this time.
It was my job this time. We're going to talk about men and the topics that matter most to them. Hopefully we make a difference in your day. A few disclaimers before we start this podcast. We might disagree with you or your personally held beliefs. In the spirit of conversation and coming together, we encourage you to stick around, even if the conversation becomes uncomfortable for you. This podcast is also not therapy. It's not a replacement for therapy. Max and I happen to be licensed therapists, and that will paint our lens at times when we are having discussions about men's mental health and issues that pertain to it. But doesn't mean that it's a replacement for therapy. We highly encourage that you seek out therapy options that make sense for you within your budget level, within your insurance coverage, and what's available. If you feel the need to go to therapy, we highly encourage it.
Psychology Today is a great resource. You can look up folks on there via your insurance, and if you want to see a guy or a girl or whatever. So, yeah.
All right. Today, though, Max, you have somebody that you'd like to recognize, a content creator or someone interesting in the space?
I do, yeah. I want to recognize Classic Kissick on Instagram. I believe his real name's Carter. He's a bodybuilder who posts some very wholesome content just about everyone being more at peace and positive with the world. And I just always appreciate his posts so much as a gym goer and someone who wants to bring some positivity to the world. So thank you, Carter. You are a wholesome dude.
Yeah, thanks, Carter, for the gym-going motivation. Awesome. Well... Speaking of being online, we've been talking about technology a lot, and today's episode is another one in the technology series. Today we're going to talk about online therapy.
Yes, we are.
Yeah. So, first of all, let's start with just what does that mean to you? When I say we're going to talk about online therapy, where are we going to?
Well, I first think of telehealth because, telehealth is just like, we're on a video screen. You're on a video screen, and then the therapist is talking to the client, just you're both on video screens. Mm-hmm. That's usually what I think of first when I think of online therapy, but I think that it has somewhat been expanded to several other platforms and other things that folks are using to access mental health services online, and we're going to kind of reflect that in this episode.
Yeah, I think some other things that come up in the space of therapy or therapy-adjacent things online are things like mindfulness apps or breathing helpers, meditation apps and things like that, but also big popular advertiser that we all see online, places like BetterHelp.
I've never heard of BetterHelp before.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into
that was a
BetterHelp is. Yeah, we've definitely got a lot of opinions on BetterHelp and similar online therapy options, kind of en masse provider therapy options, maybe I would call that.
I think that I don't know how far we're going to get in there, but yeah, there's definitely...
But outside of BetterHelp, what other spaces of mental health do we think of online? There are forums or Facebook groups, right? Like, and things like that. But specifically, if I'm looking to meet with a therapist, I'm probably going through a health system or one of these large providers like BetterHelp or, I wish I could think of the other
one that I joined.
Top of my head. But then there's also resources for finding independent providers like Psychology Today.
Yep. Yeah, I think that, first getting on the topic of BetterHelp, might as well just go there.
Sure.
So BetterHelp is a platform that you may have seen advertised to you on YouTube, especially if you encounter a men's mental health podcast. You've probably had BetterHelp advertised to you as, I think that, is it Tom Brady who's on BetterHelp? Or there's a big celebrity on, like, one of the commercials. And, a lot of their content is just, like, they're promoting therapy. They're saying, yeah, therapy is good. Having a regular therapist is like this. Like, I listen to, like, Andrew Huberman. BetterHelp sponsors Andrew Huberman, and Andrew Huberman goes... oh yes, BetterHelp is like, this really, it's a platform, and regular therapy is just like going to the doctor and making sure that you're just doing your job and your work, which actually is not an untrue statement. Going to therapy can be very helpful like that. But I believe there have been some difficult problems with BetterHelp, at least in my experience. I guess I was struck, to me, I haven't had a lot of interaction with BetterHelp personally as an organization, other than the fact that they advertise to me a lot. I was just struck by how many therapists in the field told me to not go and work with BetterHelp.
Yeah.
Like before I had really even known a lot about it. That was really surprising and kind of a red flag that I had a lot of warnings.
Yeah.
Before.
I think we can provide a little bit of that magic, behind the curtain of. Yeah, I think that in my anecdotal experience as a therapist, knowing other therapists, I don't know that I know of many, if any, off the top of my head that I've met, that I've talked to about online therapy options like BetterHelp, that thought good of it. Which is a long way to say my experience is that therapists don't think that BetterHelp is good for the therapy community, at least when you talk to them about it amongst each other.
Yeah, a lot of folks aren't really big fans of BetterHelp because of that, and I think that sometimes obviously clients have had difficult problems. Yeah, I hear Talkspace is another one.
Oh,
Yeah.
Talkspace, yes,
Yeah.
yep,
Yeah.
that is what I'm familiar with.
Yeah, and so the BetterHelps, the Talkspaces. Yeah, a lot of times folks will have negative experiences with those online providers or a single therapist online there, and other times you'll be with a therapist for like a week or two, and they'll ghost you too, is something that I've heard too. And so I do think that we as a field are having like some of those moments that aren't great, but we do think that BetterHelp has been like at least a place where this is happening for sure. And yeah, I think that the treatment of providers was what was really noticeable to me in like the feedback that I heard, that they're just not paying therapists terribly well for the work that they're doing, which doesn't feel super fair. Even if there are neat little chat features, it just sounds like therapists just aren't getting paid like a sustainable model. And really, the thing that's keeping them going is kind of this like advertising, like brand development sort of stuff. So
I use the example of your local pharmacy and big chains like CVS and Walgreens coming into town. When talking to people outside of the profession about it, I feel like a lot of people have that experience or know what I'm talking about when I say that look at over the last 20 years the difference in the small town pharmacy and what happened when places like CVS, Walgreens, your larger drugstores came into town, kind of monopolized the industry. A lot of pharmacists end up closing their local mom and pop shops, join them, and then there was all sorts of problems in the early 2010s around pay in pharmacies, and we're still seeing that today with extreme staffing shortages with with pharmacy techs and the like, because of this monopolization that happens. That once a big company comes in and forces out all of its competition, they can set the rules. And so I think that as a therapist, that's the thing that for me provides caution. And so I think it's also important to note on that line, before we get too much further into BetterHelp, that I got to be upfront that because of that, I have some level of bias. I don't think that you should use BetterHelp. It wouldn't be necessarily my recommendation. I think that if there's a situation where that's the only option that's provided to you, I think something is better than nothing, 100%. But I think as we go further into the podcast today, I've got several things that I'll share that definitely give me pause when I think about whether or not I would recommend it to a friend.
Yeah, and I want to be transparent too, Ben. I'm not sure if you even know this, but I joined Alma, which is kind of like one of those platforms, like fairly recently, and that's where I'm doing my private practices through Alma. I will say that to me, Alma has offered a little bit more of a reasonable thing that has made my life easier, and where I'm compensated like a fair amount, and so I'm feeling good about like joining Alma. And so, but at the same time, I do hear your concerns about like, hey, having a big conglomerate is dangerous. But as someone who's trying to start his private practice on the side and doesn't have a lot of time to go through credentialing and like all that junk, it's nice to get my foot in the door somewhere for sure. And so, but yeah, I definitely have not heard good things about BetterHelp from the therapist community.
Well, I think that's an important distinction to make. I think that from what I've understood from my conversations with you and what I've seen about Alma, like on the internet and whatnot, is that it seems like from an inside the industry perspective, BetterHelp is coming in with this provide the cheapest possible service to the customer. It's a very McDonald's burger, right? The reduced it down to its fundamentals to be well packaged and produced in a timely capitalist driven time is money structure, right? And there are services right out there that are varying on the levels of like there are services that help therapists that are in private practice with things like billing, with things like managing their EHR system is outsourced, right? Because you are somewhere like Alma handles things like that, and I think that that's a bit different from my understanding of what BetterHelp is. Yeah, it takes care of, some of the like EHR stuff and managing insurances, but they do that at such, the reason that BetterHelp is pernicious is they charge you for that as the therapist, right? You're not making as much as you could.
I think that when I look at like companies that are advertising to me pretty aggressively, I usually go, okay, how do they have that money? Where are they getting that from? And to me, my inclination is BetterHelp is probably, lifting it up off the top. And I don't want it to be just like a we don't like BetterHelp episode too.
Right. But let's talk about some legitimate ethical concerns that I have. My understanding of BetterHelp, I have written down a couple of different ways that I do think that these could be used positively, but I do have some concerns about. We talked about the video one-to-one interface nature of telehealth therapy, right?
Yeah.
However, I know that in advertising that I've received for BetterHelp, and in my looking into this and getting ready for today's episode, BetterHelp still advertises that it offers phone, no video, phone therapy options, as well as text only therapy options, which the futurist in me and the person that's excited for the future of the profession in me is really excited about some of those concepts. But I'm also aware, as somebody that has worked within, for a clinic, trying not to dox myself here, sorry. Having worked for a clinic, knowing how billing and insurance works, right? It's a different ballgame if you're only texting with somebody versus interfacing with them via telehealth or interfacing with them in person. And we recently had these conversations. This is fresh in my mind because with the pandemic, it was on everybody's tongue.
Yeah, there was some controversy about, whether insurance companies would cover telehealth or not. And then it ended up being, kind of like mandated and whatever. And so, yeah, I'm not sure if insurance really even has a billing code for telephone or for texting. And so I do wonder if those are covered by insurance or if BetterHelp has negotiated something unique with insurance there. But yeah, I do have, it gives me some pause based on how the counselors have been trained, at least.
Yeah.
There are also like 988 has a text line.
Yeah.
And so there's folks
crisis lines are awesome.
There's folks who are doing that. For those who don't know, 988 is the National Suicide Hotline. You can dial it at any time if you're even just having a mental health crisis. It's pretty neat.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that, so there is some text happening, but the question is it covered by insurance? 988 is just a free service, but BetterHelp is I would wonder if that is covered by insurance.
Yeah.
And also, if BetterHelp is getting it exclusively for themselves covered by insurance, then I'm like, well, excuse me, how come Mr. Dr. Max in his little private practice can't be doing that?
Well, and that's actually what brings me to my other thought on it is I often hear that BetterHelp and similar services are popping up, as the market is responding to a need for affordable therapeutic services that can be found in a timely manner. And so I looked into how much it is. And the average that BetterHelp themselves reports that their services cost is that an individual user can expect to pay $65 to $100 per week receiving services.
Interesting.
Now, when I think of once monthly outpatient, right? So when I'm making some logical leaps here, so let me go backwards a step. When I think of BetterHelp and I think of the telehealth BetterHelp method, especially knowing the efficacy, which we'll get into in a bit, right? I'm not thinking of the types of disorders or mental health conditions that are less common. BetterHelp and the efficacy information that I've seen for telehealth suggests that it's best used for generalized anxiety, depression, others what are considered the more likely treatment outcomes for like CBT, right? It's been linked with being effective, telehealth has with CBT. And so when I think of BetterHelp, and I think, all right, so if my average user is likely experiencing symptoms of like depression or generalized anxiety disorder, again, from their own data, how are they experiencing that website? How are they experiencing receiving that care? And is that the same as it would be had they not?
It is a good question if, telehealth is ultimately like as good as in-person therapy. Where I get stuck with, like services generally is if someone's paying for a service and they're satisfied by the service, you kind of got to let them enjoy the service too. Because I'm sure there's at least one person out there who has enjoyed their relationship with their BetterHelp therapist, whether it's text, video, phone, or whatever. And it's kind of like, well, that's great for you. Good. Go on, do that. That's awesome. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that.
I wonder about that.
Yeah.
Compared to, right? If high end, $100 a week is $400 a month, right? So I think the cited, reasoning that it's even in some of the scientific journals that I looked at before today. There's kind of this, just for granted, it's not even a cited notion that one of the reasons that people are seeking out online therapy services like BetterHelp is that it's cost effective compared to seeking out, private therapy, which I guess if you're receiving weekly sessions, perhaps, but I also then call into question, especially under like a CBT model, I question whether or not weekly therapy services are required, and if there isn't a place where the financial interests of the company are at odds with encouraging people to have weekly therapy sessions.
Yeah, and I think that if we're looking at also, why, if you've ever been ghosted by a therapist, I've heard of this before, where you just call the therapist and they don't respond to you, or even see them once or twice, but then they just don't respond to you again. A lot of times the therapist is then just kind of looking at their bottom line and going, well, I've got all the clients that I need. I don't need another one. And then they just kind of let things fall through the cracks so they don't tell people that they're closing shop, possibly. And so I think that what you're saying, Ben, is that BetterHelp represents this greed, kind of point of therapy, where it's not necessarily about providing the client care, but it's more about like getting some profit off the top.
Yeah, I think that there's a side effect to running everything like a business, and I think this comes up in healthcare across the spectrum quite a lot, right? The question of is the healthcare system as it is established and as we have it today designed in a way that allows us to be free from the needs of making a profit? And the unfortunate answer is no.
Well, where I struggle with the healthcare system right now is that the number of navigators that are there for one, consumers to just figure out the system is kind of ridiculous. And then the number of navigators who are there and have jobs just to exist to help providers navigate the whole system is honestly also kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so it continues to be frustrating to me that there seems to be insurance and then the people who deal with insurance and then actually the providers, and really it should just kind of be provider insurance. It should be easy for providers to submit things. It should be easy for claims to get paid. You shouldn't have to fight your insurance for forever to do these things. I think that when a company is really thinking more about money than about patient care, that's negative. And I'm sure the BetterHelp, if they watch this episode, they'd probably tweet out, that, BetterHelp loves patient care. We want to make all our patients feel better, which, to be honest, they probably would, because it would make them more money. But there's a difference between we want to do it because it helps people and we want to do it because it makes more money.
You don't stay in business if you're not working somewhat.
Yeah.
Right?
And you want to make money, but you also want to help people.
Yeah.
that's why I got in the profession. And I mean, I want to be able to make a living too, which I think everyone is.
I think
struggling with
therapists definitely have a
nowadays.
right to want to make a living. 100%.
Yeah, you had something about the FTC on
Yes.
BetterHelp as well.
I
I thought was really the most like, okay, I would notice this.
Yeah, I think that so moving out of the lens a little bit of just from within the profession and ethical stance, questions that I have around BetterHelp, a thing that I think is important for our listeners and for both of us to know, and for me to share here is this is actually from the Federal Trade Commission, the government, the FTC's website, ftc.gov. This is their own article regarding the recent rulings that were made against BetterHelp. Although its exact wording has changed over time, the company, BetterHelp, assured people that aside from a few narrow uses related to providing online counseling services, their private information would remain private. In addition, for more than 3 years, BetterHelp told people thinking about signing up for Faithful Counseling, Pride Counseling, or Teen Counseling that their email addresses would be kept strictly private and never shared, sold, or disclosed with anyone. Despite those promises, the FTC says that BetterHelp used a wide variety of tactics to share the health information of over 7 million consumers with platforms like Facebook, Snapchat, Criteo, and Pinterest for the purpose of advertising. You'll want to read the complaint for details, but here are a few examples. In 2017, BetterHelp allegedly uploaded the email addresses of current and former clients to Facebook, nearly 2 million in total, to target them with ads that tell them to refer their Facebook friends to BetterHelp for mental health services. During another period, the FTC says BetterHelp disclosed to Facebook for advertising purposes the previous therapy of 1.5 million people who visited or used BetterHelp's site. The source of that information, their response to the intake question, have you been in counseling or therapy before? So they took that data, tied that to people's email addresses, and let Facebook know so that Facebook could have better advertisements. But that's not all.
Sounds bad.
Yeah, that's not all.
Well, for those who don't know, I suppose HIPAA is an important law in the United States. Basically,
we should take a pause for HIPAA.
Basically, just saying that your health information is really private, and so it's actually very, very egregious for a therapist to disclose any information about you to anyone, and especially private and identifying information such as your email address, or where you live, or your full name.
That's huge.
That's really unacceptable, and to do it just for ads is very disappointing.
Yeah. That is a disappointing reality of the profit-driven world that we often exist within.
Yeah.
But that's not all. According to the complaint, BetterHelp broke its privacy promises by disclosing to Snapchat the IP and email addresses of approximately 5.6 million former visitors to target them with BetterHelp ads on the Snapchat platform. In addition, for a 6-month period, the company disclosed to Criteo the email addresses of over 70,000 visitors, including people who looked into Pride Counseling and Faith Counseling. Similarly, for a 1-year period, BetterHelp disclosed visitors' email addresses to Pinterest. But what was in it for BetterHelp? According to the complaint, using this health information for advertising, BetterHelp had brought in hundreds of thousands of new users, resulting in millions of dollars in additional revenue. The final settlement that BetterHelp had to pay this year, actually just a few months ago, was $7.8 million, which is a tiny slap on the wrist if we're being real. My personal opinion on that is wow, that's a really cheap cost of doing business if you're somebody like BetterHelp, if you've got the millions that they're raking in.
Yeah, if you just look at a simple, if you're a business person and you just look at a simple cost benefit analysis there, did they make more than 7.8 million on those ads? If it got them, a certain number of clients, then it's simply like, yeah, okay, they did it, and yeah, it will be difficult to convince them to do something different next time, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's an example of what I was getting at a little bit before. Of I think sometimes the systems around healthcare, whether it's therapy, physical health, or mental health, physical health, the systems that our society have built around healthcare and how healthcare is provided to people and who pays for it, create situations like that where the providers, right? The people that are working at BetterHelp as providers certainly aren't, individually going to Facebook and selling the email addresses of their clients, but the organizational structure that is paying those therapists and providing the service of connecting people with clients with their therapists, which I think haven't stated is a value, but they're profiting off that in a way that is...
It seems really negative.
Yeah.
I'm always skeptical about when someone is advertising something to me, which, I mean, who likes ads?
Right.
Ben, do you like ads?
No, I do not.
Yeah, I don't like ads.
I'm an avid ad block user on several platforms. Yeah.
I'm sure. I will say that one thing that has grinded my gears is, I'm a therapist, so I get mental health ads all the time. I have gotten a lot of ads for men's mental health apps, that are online. And so there's actually several mental health apps that I've used in like my practice and have been recommended to me. The Calm app is one you've probably heard of before, where they have like guided meditation exercises, relaxing breathing stuff. A lot of things you can also find like that on just YouTube if you search up, guided meditation or, relaxing breathing or whatever. But I was at a conference recently. I was told about an app called Don't Panic, which is actually pretty neat and allows you to.
The name's interesting.
It has several. It was actually like it was like Czech for a while. I have that app on my phone, and I think it's like a Czech name. But it has like several grounding activities on it, which are cool and allow you to get out of a crisis situation very much. And then it also allows you to put a safety plan in there. And I'm planning on using it in my private practice with my clients to help them do safety plans if they're experiencing thoughts of self-harm. But cool. I will say that I've seen a lot of apps for advertisements that are not Calm, that are not, these safety planning apps.
Didn't Chris Hemsworth have one for a while?
I think that he had it was like a fitness
plan. It was like a holistic health.
Holistic health.
Yeah, sure. I thought Chris Hemsworth was gonna fix your life. That's the impression I got from the ads. I was like, damn, Chris Hemsworth.
The one that really sticks out in my head is the Mental app, and I feel like we're just having this we hate X app today.
Yeah,
but
maybe
the Mental app, it was like it has like a pixelated picture of this guy who's like Tyler felt behind in life. Tyler downloaded Mental app, so that he could, do X, every day. He looked at, Stoic philosophy instead of scrolling Instagram every day. Tyler became the man women want to marry, and he's buff with like sunglasses and whatever. And I was just like, oh my God, I had a visible facepalm about just like
Just listen to that language. The algorithm is just
at work
there with.
And I think that, we're in a place, too, where, men are feeling more insecure about their masculinity. And they're needing to feel like they need to prove it for some reason. Men are, by and large, not getting college degrees as much as they used to. They're not, graduating high school as much as they used to. They're, feeling a lot more devoid of meaning than they used to. And I looked at this ad and I looked at, who was probably looking at it, and I felt so sad because I know it's preying on that guy's insecurities, and I really, really hated that. I think that Mental advertised that they were, thinking about having, an AI coach and content that you're supposed to read, every day, and that this is somehow, a replacement for therapy or somehow better than therapy because they didn't enjoy having experience with a therapist. Now, I will say, Ben, that I am the first advocate for, if you are looking for a therapist, it is okay to interview a few therapists, to go to Psychology Today, to find a few people that you feel like you would trust, and just go on, 3 therapy dates and then pick the best one. That's totally fine. That's totally normal. And if you've been with your therapist for several years and you're feeling like you want to change, change it up or even take a break from therapy. But I was worried about, a lot of guys who find it difficult to ask for help. And a lot of times I think that as guys, we don't want to say that we're not okay. I'm a very independent person. I feel like I work all the time, and every once in a while I go, God damn, I feel like I can't stop. And if I ask someone to do this for me, they're not going to get it done right. And so I have to keep doing it. And so I think that we need to practice sometimes being vulnerable and talking about shit. And if we're not practicing talking about shit, things are just not going to get better. And I think that, apps like Mental, if you're just using that for your mental health and you're not, being a little more vulnerable with your friends, you're not going to get like terribly far. Now, again, I'm going to say what I said earlier. If you're using a service and you like the service and you're paying for it and it makes you feel good, like that's great. Like, feel free to keep on doing that. That's good.
You should.
You should do it if it's helpful for you. But I worry based on like the advertisement that I saw for mental, really just preying on like your insecurities or my insecurities, that, it's not necessarily a good replacement for therapy. I think it can definitely be a supplement, and everyone is different and needs their different things, but I think there are a lot of experiences in therapy that folks can have. They can be individual, group, and family, and whatever else. There's a lot of different things that you can do to support your mental health. But yeah, I mean, if you think that an app like Mental is something you want to try out, that's cool. I'd also encourage you to check out like Don't Panic or Calm. I think that those are apps that I would feel a little better about. Maybe it's just because of my bias on advertising.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah. Well, I think that's a great close to our first half of our episode today. Do you have some philosophy that you'd like to share with the chat?
I do have some poorly explained philosophy.
We've got some poorly explained philosophy to explain.
Are you familiar with the Noble Savage?
Now, when you say that, I'm drawn back to several undergraduate class experiences and perhaps a graduate school class experience.
It brings me to undergrad as well.
Now, I think, if you want, I'll just shoot at what I think the Noble Savage is.
Go nuts.
I think that it is often brought up as an example of a way that history has created a racist caricature that is a romanticization of particularly the way that indigenous people in the United States existed pre-contact with what is the colonizing population of Western Europeans that arrived. And so, to me, what I think of is the way that I experienced or encountered in conversations in undergraduate the people that expressed the ways that those stereotypes had affected their life.
Yeah, so I think that you definitely hit the nail on the head with probably is racist and was written by 18th century Europeans thinking about Native Americans. But I think that as a philosophical exercise, there is value to it. And, I'm one of those people that I don't really want to throw the baby out without the bathwater. And so the Noble Savage is attributed primarily to Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, and at its fundamental core, it's this idea that in their natural state, human beings are pure. They're without sin, as they would write back then. I don't know if I would write that right now, but that people are inherently good when they are just little cavemen or barbarians, going through the little wilds. And I think that I just came from a conference last week with a bunch of other professionals here in Minnesota, and I remember getting up we were talked to as being it's rewilding a little bit, where you're doing something with your body, and I do think that there is some kind of a movement today, like romanticization. I see a lot of like Viking stuff, and I'm a Viking enthusiast myself in a lot of ways. But I see so much about like Vikings and this and that. Like I feel like everywhere I go nowadays, and I'm kind of like I feel like we're romanticizing the Noble Savage a little bit more as a society, and we're thinking more and more about like how we can be like our ancestors, way back when. And I mean, yes, sure, there's definitely like the racist aspect of I mean, this was probably written, and we're looking at like Native Americans as savage, which already is totally not. No, that's bad. But at the same time, I'm looking at, the Noble Savage as, are humans inherently good? Is kind of the question that I feel like is posed with that. And I also think that in our modern society, we sometimes get just like really disconnected from the way that we evolved to be in being outside, being on our feet, moving a lot, being physically active. And I think that there are ways in which we can think about the ways that we were, and that could improve our lives today. And so I do think that, a little more modern interpretation of the Noble Savage has some value. What do you think, Ben?
I think it's interesting. I think that I went to a more religiously inclined school for my graduate studies, and so I encountered a lot of philosophical thought around the nature of evil, and the concepts of original sin. And I think that it's interesting that you mentioned that the concept of the noble savage, you said, appears first around the 1800s with this writer that, from what I understand at that time, then would be pretty countercultural in stating that human beings are innately good. I think that from what I understand, much of the Christian world, and particularly the puritanical rooted American Christian theological sphere, was very much in assertion that it was starting to get really popular that the Bible is literal for the first time, and it was starting to get really popular that original sin, eating the apple in the Garden of Eden, was enough to make everybody evil at their core. And so I think, as you're saying, to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, it sounds like to me somebody at the time was having some thoughts that maybe people aren't
the other way
so bad.
Yeah, and I should be clear that when I encountered the Noble Savage, it was a summary written by Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan, which basically proposes the complete opposite.
Yeah.
So I think that obviously there were intellectual dialogues back then, as there were now, about what is the true nature of humans. But I I guess to me, like, I want to acknowledge that sometimes I think it's hard to believe that humans are inherently good.
Yeah, I think that actually, I'll that. I mean, yeah, sometimes it is, but that blew my mind for a lot of my educational years, being in rooms with people that, like, the majority of the room thought that human beings by their nature are evil, was a wild trip for me. I don't think that way. I think that people are born good. I do, and I think it's an example to me of when I think about, like, the value of, like, a college education. I think that one of those values that I definitely received from it was the ability to wrestle with concepts that, like, I had just taken for true so much that I hadn't thought about how would I academically defend my own position on it until I had to in a classroom. And I think that that's one of the values of having an education, a liberal arts education.
Ben, how do you think, if humans are inherently good, how do you think that they become bad? Because we can certainly acknowledge that, like, Hitler,
that's a good question.
We can certainly acknowledge that Hitler and Mussolini and whoever else existed, or exists today, Putin, whatever. But how do people become bad if they are inherently good? Like, what are the conditions under which that happen? I mean, if you don't know, or you're still thinking about it, I have some ideas.
Well, the question is, I think that my mind is jumping to and so why not just go ahead to it? I think that it's a matter of rhetoric a little bit first. What lens do we view? What defines good in this instance, right? I think that
altruism,
right? Yes, I think that if we define, like, altruistic behavior as a definition of moral goodness within a sentient being, then I think human beings are born good, and you have to be taught not to be altruistic.
Yeah.
But I think that if we question, like, let's think something really masculine, 300, right?
Sure, yeah.
This is the little Spartan boys, as a test of their commitment and their masculinity and their prowess, right? They were starved and then had to go to the market and steal food, right? Even though that was wrong, right? And that concept comes up a lot of the is it evil to steal food if you're truly starving? And I think that in order to ask whether or not, are people born good and how do they become evil, we have to first ask ourselves, what kind of good are we defining? Because I wouldn't call you evil the moment that you steal a loaf of bread because you're starving. But if you would, then if your definition is that way, then I think that my definition of how you become evil changes.
Well, I think that I look at the Noble Savage and I think of traumatic reenactments, or this idea that if you experience trauma as a human being, that you are bound to repeat that trauma onto someone else. So, for example, if you are sexually abused as a child, you might have sexualized behaviors in like the classroom, and then teachers will assume that you're sexually abused if you had sexual behaviors in the classroom. It was like a whole thing, for a long time as a professional who worked in the school.
Yep.
And so, to me, is it that trauma is truly the source of all evil? That, one time, one person, committed that original sin or whatever. I'm not even someone super into
like somebody else's trauma all the way back.
And then suddenly, we kind of did this one-up thing, and eventually we have World War II, and the Holocaust, and whatever else is going on. Is it always just, I'm going to one-up what that other person did to me, or it's only okay? I will say that, one of the prevailing theories about suicide says that acquired capability is an important part of it. I feel like we're enjoying the poorly explained philosophy this time. We're just expanding it a bit. But acquired capability is the idea that if you've, experienced violence or been exposed to violence or have attempted, self-harm before, you're more likely to do it again.
Sure.
And so obviously, 988 is a great resource. If you're ever experiencing those feelings, please do dial them. Just heard wonderful things about them recently at a conference too. But yeah, the idea that maybe is there acquired capability for evil, and that if you, have been exposed to the original sin, across all the things throughout all the time, does that make you, more propense to evil? Which actually is interesting that original sin is like a human thing, because to me, it's very humanist in idea that, humans created the meaning of that bad. And also, like, does bad have meaning without good? Does good have meaning without bad?
When you mentioned the having to acquire a capacity for evil, that made me think about, at least to me, my brain immediately went, of course, because I'm drawn to think about, like, I know the statistics from World War II versus World War One in the efficacy of soldiers actually hitting their enemy combatants went through the roof between World War One and World War Two. World War One, largely the population was not experienced with guns, and many, especially near the end of the war, as young men are in short supply in Europe, many of these young men in the trenches of World War One are shooting above enemy heads, and that in between World War One and World War Two, especially the U.S. industrial war machine, in particular, got very good at training young men to be indifferent to the death of an enemy human being. And that's like an entire, it's a dark side of our profession. I would say dark side there. I'm putting a value on it, but that's a component of our profession, is of psychology is, right. The American military has changed the way that it trains its soldiers in boot camp to condition them to be capable of doing what the American military
needs them to
do. Yeah, and that's something that we know, right, from those studies, and from that is something that you can get more comfortable with. You can be trained to be comfortable with.
You can become comfortable with that too. Yeah, it's difficult. I think that it's you can. Is it Faramir has a quote from Lord of the Rings that's something around the lines of, like, I don't have love, for the sword, but I have love for what the sword protects. And so, to what extent is it the ends justify the means a little bit there, where you protect something that needs to be protected? I do think we have to ask that question at a certain point, because in World War II, I think that it was certainly necessary for the United States to be able to do something to stop Hitler from taking over the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, when is that line drawn? When is it bad enough?
Yeah.
Is good. But yeah, the Noble Savage, huh?
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. I have on our return to topic is therapy better in person? Off the hip, yes or no? Is therapy better in person or online?
I'll be honest, I like therapy better in person. I think that we are all living really busy schedules nowadays, and the fact that there's an option for it online is really, really good. I think that there are a lot of good online resources, like Don't Panic and Calm. I can really help you in difficult situations or just with your everyday like mental wellness. But if it comes to just like real like therapy, I think that I have preferred in person for myself. I prefer seeing clients in person. I think that digital or telehealth is a really good backup, but I think that if I was going to stare at a screen all day, I would really, really hate myself. And I think that in this increasingly disconnected world, it's more and more important for us to be in space together. And I will say that, like, as someone who has sat on like Zoom calls, not necessarily that our group therapy, but even that our like classes and large open groups, I just can't imagine that being a powerful interpersonal experience, because I'll disclose that I've been to group therapy before, and just like that is something that I know can't
It's so different online.
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly see the nonverbals online, and like, because a lot of our communication is nonverbal, you can see those nonverbals online, but it was so much more organic in person, and I don't think that could be accomplished online well enough. So I would say, like, decisively, for me as a professional, therapy is better in person, but I always understand when folks are needing to be digital because of their schedules. So,
and this might be painted a bit by our lenses, but I tend to agree with you as well. I personally think that in-person therapy is generally superior. But I'm also aware that in my experience, older clients, young adults, it's way easier than with like 8-9-year-olds. Working with kids, telehealth is limiting in the way that play therapy based interventions can be utilized, and it also is super limiting, right? Like doing narrative therapy, doing anything that requires a piece of paper, is harder. Online than it is in person. That being said, I am also aware, caveat, most of the studies are about CBT, but there are several studies that I looked at, and of course lost my... Oh, here we go. Heidman Lagerlof et al. In 2023, and as well as Fernandez et al. In 2020, both found that CBT has similar efficacy. I think the first one that I mentioned, the one from 2023, found that, again, they were only looking at CBT and generalized anxiety disorder and depression, but the first one found that they were the same in person versus telehealth. The second one found that they were about the same, with a slight advantage being to in person, and which is not super surprising to me.
Well, to me, I think that it's difficult, because if you are doing an intervention with fidelity, that's like CBT, where you're looking at the triangle, you're looking at your ABC chart, things are like super, super concrete.
You're like doing worksheets.
Yep, you're doing if you're doing CBT worksheets, like, ultimately that's not going to be terribly different in person versus virtual. And I think there are a lot of folks who are looking for treatment like that, and if that's what you're doing, then that's great news for you. If you're looking for a deep interpersonal process, I think that might be more difficult. I do know that, like, research has consistently shown that it's like, half the change in therapy is about the therapeutic relationship, like how much you trust the therapist and the bond that you build there. And so I do think that there's challenges to building that online, but I also, am speaking this way, and then I kind of look at myself and I'm like, is this an okay boomer moment, that someone would read me and they'd be like, he's a boomer, and I'm like, I'm not a boomer, I'm a millennial. Just
I think being a therapist that uses the narrative lens a lot. I've used narrative therapy techniques via telehealth, and a lot more in person. There's a lot of things, I understand the regimented, more, I like to say, like, better for type A personality type, like CBT, DBT, your 3-letter modalities that have worksheets and planned out schedules for therapy. That totally makes more sense for telehealth, it totally makes more sense that it could be either or. But there are just like sometimes when you're laying on the floor with a blanket and a rope and some rocks and some flowers, you can't do that online, and that's hard for them to quantify as well.
There's also strange advantages to being on telehealth too.
There
so,
are.
for example, when we're in the pandemic, a common method that I would use with kids is like we're going to do a scavenger hunt, and you've probably done the scavenger hunt before, where go find a green toy, go find a toy that makes you think of your mom, your brother, go find a toy that makes you feel happy when you're sad.
Mm-hmm.
You can actually see into their world quite a bit, and there's some excitement sometimes about let me see. Can I see your house, and let me show you my house, and look how proud I am of this thing. And then there's the cat on the Zoom shoulder. We've all been there in that meeting, right? But
I think one big thing I lament from early to early mid-pandemic was when we as a culture were still figuring out the social rules of video conferencing with each other.
That was hilarious.
That
was absolutely hilarious.
Not really any with my kid clients. They're connected to the internet, connected to technology, so they were on board right away. But so many parents that just it was just it felt like for a long time there was this long song and dance of like, well, do I really have to say out loud that you should turn your video on for this video call or not? And there's that wanting to be an accepting and understanding therapist, and like also you have to do your job, and the insurance really wants you to make sure that you've got the video on when you're talking to people, because that's how we bill, and everything like that. I just lament. I'm glad that we as a culture seem to have got better as we got more adept as a whole society at
it's
using
also
Zoom.
Not better. People will log on, they'll be like, their video will be off, and I'll just be like, oh, can't see you, and sometimes I have to be like, I'm not sure if that's what you were wanting right now, or that's what's going on, because I don't really mind like if their video is off and they're wanting to have like a phone call for a little while. At the same time, it's like, whatever, insurance and stuff.
I never had an issue with whether or not we had our video. Honestly, maybe against some of our points earlier, didn't really seem to matter to me quite a few times whether or not the video was actually on when you're having a good conversation and things like that. And so I guess what I'm lamenting more is just like the fact that it was a new thing we had to talk about. It felt like when the phone got invented and they didn't know there wasn't a universal agreed upon you say hello, so people would say howdy and ahoy hoy and all sorts of stuff like that.
I will say that you can put your favorite Zoom awkward moment like in the comments. I'll say my favorite one was always like, the other person is logged on, they don't know how to get their sound on, and you have to point in the bottom left corner of the screen and then text them, where to find the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Good times, you guys. Good times.
Yeah. And I think some of my favorites were, and I can't even remember, it's you so easily forget those moments of like what actually was said, but you remember the like, oh, that person didn't realize that their microphone was off and they said something brutally honest in the group chat or whatever, and like those moments are some of the highlights of working with Zoom.
Or they're unmuted and they say this meeting doesn't matter in the middle of a meeting, and then it's like 20 other people. That's super awkward.
Yes. But I think that it's winding down on our time here for tonight's episode, and as we approach, I'm going to shift us over to our usual closing segment of Who Saved the World. Mm-hmm. I've got one that I'm pretty excited about to share.
Go nuts.
Because I think it's pretty fun. Because I think you've got to have a particular lens about history to agree with me, but I think that you will. That Sima Qian, and I hope that I am pronouncing that as best I can, was a Chinese historian during the Han Dynasty from 145 to 86 BCE, before the Common Era.
All right.
So 200 years BC-ish. He's considered the father of Chinese historiography for writing a book that is known in English as the records of the Grand Historian. And this guy, looking into this guy's life was really fun. I just kind of happened upon this. I think I was browsing Reddit, and it was a Wikipedia hole that I ended up in. And you start on, like, I think I was actually looking at Greek philosophers for poorly explained philosophy, and you end up over at Chinese historians.
Sometimes that just happens.
Yeah, but he ended up writing this book, Records of the Grand Historian. It's a general history of China that covers the beginning from the rise of a legendary yellow emperor and the formation of the first Chinese polity to reign over the Emperor Wu of Han, during which Sima wrote. Actually, I think his first name would be Qian. As the first, or his given name, not his family name. His family name is Sima, so he would go by Qian. As the first universal history of the world as it was known to the ancient Chinese, the Records of the Grand Historian served as a model for official history writing for subsequent Chinese dynasties and all of the Sinosphere in general until the 20th century. So it's the OG history book for what is one of the largest language families on the face of the earth.
Yeah.
So Sima Qian writing this doesn't just happen just because he feels like it, and not because some emperor just told him to. His father, Sima Tan, first conceived of the project of writing a complete history of China, but he completed only some of the preparatory materials at the time of his death. When his dad died, his dad was an astrologer for the Chinese imperial court, which this is 200 BC, and the Chinese imperial court, astrologers are not like high-ranking positions of power. They're the calendar keeper dudes that decide which Monday of the month is, this holiday going to be. Reading of the signs of the stars, when's a good time to plant the fields, things like that. So often, because they were calendar keepers as well, right, they end up becoming scribes, history keepers, things like that. It was considered a low-ranking court position, and it just tracked the movements of celestial bodies. As a young man, being at least part of the bureaucracy enough that he was able to be educated formally. Sima Qian was formally educated in the Confucian school across China. He moved around a lot, essentially because his dad had at least a court position. That afforded him the ability to gain an education that by the time he was 35, the emperor would entrust him with at least the journaling of a small army. While he was away recording the positions of that army, his father fell ill, and he was pulled away from the battlefield. He actually rode home during a battle and made it in time before his father died, as the legend goes, or as the history is recorded, to hear his father's dying wish that his son, Sima Qian, would write the complete history of China. And as I mentioned, he was raised in the Confucian school, which is relatively new at this time in world history, but is really rooted in filial piety, which is the semi-Latinized fancy academic way of saying
loyalty to your family,
loyalty to your father, loyalty to your family. And so Sima Qian took it upon him as his life's goal and his life's work to write a complete history of China, which I can't stress enough is a novel concept. It's crazy that his dad thought of it, and it's crazy that he was capable of doing it. Not too many years later, he's still working on compiling the records of the Grand Historian. He is not done. It becomes known as the Shiji. It is just Shiji in Chinese. He actually ends up being involved in an argument at the emperor's court. So two generals had gone out on a military campaign. They had suffered some great losses, and they were saying to the emperor that each other was to blame. Sima Qian was not friends with Li Ling, a general at the time, who was being ordered to be executed for his failure to succeed in his military campaign. And Sima Qian essentially stuck his neck out, lower-ranking court official, didn't really have the social clearance to do this, he interrupted court and said that Li Ling is a good man and he wouldn't be lying. Because of this, the emperor stayed the execution against Li Ling and ordered that Sima Qian be executed in his place for standing up for him. Which, again, court rules at this time get kind of sticky.
Wild.
But yes, right? So now we've got this whole... Wow, I mean, this guy, like, knowing that the sentence could be death, stepped out and said that this man is a good man and was willing to stand beside him. And so, possibly partially also knowing this loophole in the law and customs at the time, men like himself, educated men who were unmarried, could choose, if they had been ordered to be executed, they could choose to be castrated instead. Nobody ever chose this. This was often considered the coward's way out, but it was an option for some scholars. That was essentially after some cultural reformation at the time, it had kind of fallen out of practice. Sima Qian, in deference to his father, actually chose to live the rest of his life castrated so that he could finish the records of the Grand Historian, finally completing the Shiji before dying. Much later in life. At one point, he wrote to a colleague, Ren An, who had asked him why he chose castration instead of death. And Sima Qian wrote, "If even the lowest slave or scullion maid can bear to commit to their own death, why should not one like myself be able to do what has to be done? But the reason I have not refused to bear these ills and have continued to live, dwelling in vileness and disgrace without taking my leave, is that I grieve that I have things in my heart which I have not been able to express fully, and I am shamed to think that after I am gone my writings will not be known to posterity. Too numerous to record are the men of ancient times who were rich and noble, and whose names have yet vanished away. It is only those who were masterful and sure, the truly extraordinary men, who are still remembered." And it sounds like he was right. The Shiji is one of the most important historical texts in all of human history, and it came out of one young man's love for his father that transcended even when being given the option of a noble death or living in what was cultural disgrace at the time. He chose to live out his life and pursue that lifelong passion of creating a history.
I think that he definitely made a case for humans are inherently good. And
Yeah.
if humans are inherently good, I certainly hope that they can do their duty like he did.
Yeah. I think that there's something, especially, I really like that segment from him discussing Ren An. I think that, or talking with Ren An, I think that they're, of course, culturally and at the time, a little bit more loose with language about wanting to die than maybe we are today. Mm-hmm. But I think that there's something really profound in there about wanting to continue to live because there are things yet still I need to express. There are yet still things that I want to do.
That their destiny is still unfulfilled.
Yeah. And that commitment to that was obviously strong enough to see him through to a monumental work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that is something fundamental about the human condition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, that's my argument. Sima Qian might have saved the world just a little bit.
I think he may have done something good, yeah. And that ends today's episode. But yeah, we're really glad that you joined or watched later. And yeah, from both of us here at Max Men Save the World, thank you guys so much, and we'll see you next time.
Have a good night.